The Sculptor's Funeral is brought to you by Audible.com. Get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/sculpt. Over 150,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. That's audibletrial.com/sculpt. From Florence, Italy, the city of inspiration for sculptors in ages past and for centuries to come, you're listening to The Sculptor's Funeral. Hello, everyone. Welcome again to another episode of The Sculptor's Funeral. I'm your host, Jason Arkles, broadcasting on this rather chilly morning from Florence, Italy, where all the great sculptors are dead, and I don't feel so well myself. And today we're going to take a look at canons of proportion, their history, the different types that exist, and their application in sculpture. But first, we should talk a little bit about the reason they exist, right? Their nature and purpose. Now, even if you have never utilized a canon of proportion in your own work, you may know that they are generally considered a handy guide for creating a convincingly proportioned figure in a work of art without having to rely heavily on a live model. For instance, let's say you want to sculpt a figure doing a backflip. Now, how can a model hold a pose remotely similar to what you would like to portray? Now, obviously, constructing this backflipping figure will have to be drawn from other sources, such as memory or knowledge of anatomy, and maybe even photographs. But these sources may not be able to tell you everything you need to know. For instance, anatomical knowledge tells you nothing about how large a person's head should be relative to the size of that person's foot. And photos can be tricky with misleading foreshortened images and lens distortion. Memory will help if you have trained it sufficiently, but surely there is a clear guide, a rule, or principle which one can refer to in order to sort out issues of parts of the body relative to the whole. Some sort of list of measurements that could tell us that the length of the foot should be the same length as the height of the head, for instance. Some sort of rule book. In fact, that's what canon means. Canon means rule or principle or law. However, you would be mistaken if you think there is but one law, a single perfect canon of proportion. And just as there are many canons, there are many reasons these canons exist. It's not only all about getting a plausibly proportioned figure. Canons have been used to identify particular subjects in various mythologies as either gods or men, depending on how many heads high they were. Canons and their notions of ideal forms have been used to express spiritual truths or even mathematical certainties. They can be expressive of an individual sculptor's sense of aesthetics and beauty, or expressive of larger cultural norms or ideals. And as these ideals and norms change from one time and place to another, the canons also change, much like any other cultural principle or norm. So an examination of canons from a historical perspective can tell us something about the cultures which produce them. It might also lead us to explore canons in our own work, not merely as a shorthand method for getting things looking correct, but also as a means of expression. Two of the most expressive sculptors in the 20th century, Giacometti and Botero, they both use an unusual personal sense of proportion as the hallmark of their style. Now, we ourselves might not want to pursue such extremities as the rotund beach ball figures of Botero, nor the stick figures of Giacometti. But it has to be recognized that different human proportions speak to the viewer on a subtle subconscious level. And understanding this, we sculptors may be able to take advantage of this knowledge to produce more subtle and more expressive work, just by paying attention to the proportions of the figures we sculpt. So let's start at the very beginning, shall we? Canons of proportion have been around just as long as art itself. In the Old Kingdom of ancient Egypt, 4,500 years ago, canons were in use in sculpture and in painting. And maybe this isn't so surprising, really, given that hieroglyphic writing, made up of simple pictograms, it would naturally encourage a standardization of depiction for maximum legibility, right? I mean, if your ability to write clearly is tied in with your ability to produce a figure, you're going to have some sort of standard rule for it. Now, standardization is, in fact, one of the great strengths of using a canon of proportions. Let's say you're a dead pharaoh, and your pyramid tomb needs to be decorated, right, with depictions of you throughout your glorious and godlike reign. Breaking down the elements of your personal appearance into a canon of proportions, that means you can hire 20 different painters and sculptors. They can all render you, and you will be depicted in a similar way by each painter or sculptor. People will be able to tell you apart from your subjects or from your gods, because they will all be uniformly different than you, right? Maybe your subjects will be smaller while your gods might be bigger. That is the communication of ideas and identity just through proportion, right? It's a pretty useful tool. Now jump ahead a few millennia, and we see that the usefulness of canons had continued to be used by those influenced by Egyptian culture, most notably, of course, the Greeks. And, of course, it is with the ancient Greeks that art started to move in different directions to include, among other things, an aesthetic pursuit of lifelikeness and a desire to express divinity through physical perfection. And so canons evolved in Greece whose purpose was to closely adhere to proportions found in nature, but could also reflect mathematic ratios. Mathematics and number, perfect and abstract, were considered a reflection of divinity, which is also perfect and abstract. So the physical perfection of a figure was symbolic of divine perfection, right? So if you're going to sculpt a god, you have to make him mathematically perfect to reflect that god's perfection. Both the Egyptian and the early Greek systems of proportion are examples of one type of canon. That is, they are comparative or relational canons of proportion. These are canons which measure a human figure and its parts as fractions of or multiples of a base unit. For example, the Egyptian canon was based on a figure equally divided into 18 units, from the bottom of the foot to the hairline. They stopped at the hairline. They didn't go all the way up to the top of the head because the tops of the figures' heads in Egyptian art were often sort of obscured by headdresses, right? So they stopped at the hairline. So a figure in Egypt is 18 units high, and all other measurements of the parts of the figure can be expressed relative to that unit. All right? So the length of an arm is 8 units, or the distance from the heel to the waist is 10 units. Now, similarly, Greek sculptors like Phidias and Polyclitus, who were working in the 5th century BC, they developed relational canons as well. And today, this type of canon, one that relates parts to a base unit, it's a useful guideline for many sculptors to work up clay models and clay sketches with certain proportional notions in their head. Like, for example, a figure is 7.5 heads high. The span of the arms, when they're outstretched, is equal to the figure's height, and so on and so forth. The relational canons make so much sense when you think about it, right? I mean, for as long as people have been measuring things, they've been using parts of the body as units of measurement. That's why we call 12 inches a foot, because it's around the average length of a foot. The height of horses, even today, are measured in units called hands, right? A horse can be 20 hands high, for instance. Have you ever heard of a cubit? Well, if you ever wanted to know the answer to the question, what is a cubit is 6 palms long, the palm of the hand being a common unit of measurement in times past. So it should be no wonder that people measure their own bodies with these units of measurements, these units themselves based on parts of the body. And some parts of the body seem to be close to multiples of other parts, and therefore easy to remember, and are passed down in the studios of sculptors and painters as a convenient rule of thumb. In terms of the Greeks, it was Polyclitus, in particular, who has been closely identified with relational canons of proportion throughout history and right up until today. His typical ideal type of a sculpted figure has always been regarded as extremely beautiful, and countless generations of artists and art historians have tried in vain to crack the code of the base unit of his canon. There are lots of theories. There's a theory that he used the golden ratio in his canon, or his base unit was based on the little finger, or the width of the eyes. It's really anyone's guess, as none of Polyclitus's original works survive, though there are many copies which have. But what really ties Polyclitus to the idea of canons is the fact that he actually sculpted a bronze figure which he called the canon. It was regarded as his definitive statement of human symmetry, balance, proportion, rhythm, and clarity. So many scholars think that the canon might be the sculpture whose surviving copies we nowadays call the Doryphorus, or spear-bearer. Many have remarked on how unified this work seems to be, each part of the sculpture relating to the other perfectly. The importance of interrelation just wasn't in the pursuit of physical perfection, though. Relation of parts to the whole also carried symbolic weight. Ancient Greek music also reflected harmonious mathematical ratios and intervals, right? The octave, the harmonic fourth, the harmonic fifth, and so on. These all relate to the scale as part of its wholeness. Now, the perfection of number, when found in nature by the Greeks, was tangible evidence of the work of the gods. And art which incorporated this perfection of number was, by extension, approaching divinity. So mathematical relation and proportion not only made sculpture pleasing to the eye, it also became symbolically meaningful as well. Polyclitus was a sculptor of sufficient fame that he had his own school, which survived for a few generations. And it's interesting to note that his pupils, at least the ones we know of, like Lysippus, they seem to follow a different canon than that of their master. Now, this would seem to imply that a canon was not to be considered absolute, to be taught and followed as the best of all possible proportions, but possibly more of a signature, each artist developing an idea of perfection as he thought best. This view of canons as a guidepost of personal taste, it runs throughout the history of art. We find that in the entry for the word canon in the dictionary of the Académie des Beaux-Arts in the 19th century, it states, and I'll quote, "The abstract idea of proportion is superior to proportion in reality. Proportion, like beauty itself, is a noble torment of the mind, a powerful incentive to achievement. However, it can only be realized in principle. The greatest artists have sought its key, but each one was only capable of rendering proportions that had been imprinted with the artist's own taste." Unquote. So that idea of a canon of proportion being a personal thing rather than an absolute thing goes all the way back to the Greeks and survives today. Now, an early example of a complete relational canon, possibly the earliest complete one we have, comes from a Greek architect named Marcus Vitruvius Pollio, also known commonly today as Vitruvius. Now, we know of him primarily through his book De Architectura, known in English as the 10 Books on Architecture. Now, Vitruvius declared that the orders of architecture themselves, the Doric, the Ionic, the Corinthian orders, and all their proportions within these orders, reflect the proportions of the human body. In addition, Vitruvius lays out an explicit canon for the measurements of mankind, and it's a long list of body parts and how they correspond to other body parts, a relational canon. And I'll give you just a taste of them here. So according to Vitruvius, a palm is 4 fingers long, right? That kind of makes sense, doesn't it? A foot is 4 palms. A cubit, as I mentioned, is 6 palms. And 4 cubits, or 24 palms, is the height of a man. Now, I'm sure that most of you are familiar with a drawing made by Leonardo da Vinci, which illustrates the canon of Vitruvius. The drawing today is actually known as Vitruvian Man, and it is one of the most famous works in art history. It shows a man, as you know, with 2 sets of legs and 2 sets of outstretched arms, and each set of limbs is illustrating a different position, which is why he's got 8 limbs. And the figure itself stands inside a circle, which itself is inside a square. Now, Leonardo's text, which accompanies the drawing, lists the various proportions from Vitruvius's book and includes the following, quote, "If you open your legs enough that your head is lowered by 1/14 of your height, and raise your hands enough that your extended fingers touch the line at the top of your head, know that the center of the extended limbs will be the navel, and the space between the legs will be an equilateral triangle." Now, this is not coming from Vitruvius, but actually from Leonardo. And I find this extremely interesting because what Leonardo is doing is attempting to synthesize the canon of Vitruvius with geometric pattern, right? Now, this is very similar to the attempt by the Greek sculptors to align body proportion with mathematics in order to either allude to or to reveal divinity. Only with Leonardo, the aim was to align physical human beauty with the rationality, harmony, and balance of abstract geometry. Now, I want to stop right here and highlight this, all right, about the pursuits of Polyclitus, Vitruvius, and Leonardo. The point of their work with canons of proportion had a very, very different purpose than what I think most artists have today, right? Today, whether we use canons or not, we tend to think of them as guides for constructing a convincing figure without having to rely on a living model. A somewhat useful shorthand, right? I've mentioned that before. A shorthand for getting things to look right. But what Polyclitus and Vitruvius and Leonardo, all great artists and great thinkers, what they were doing is completely different. They were studying the human body and its measurements in order to find meaning within these measurements. Or conversely, they imposed measurements onto their forms in order to use the body as a vehicle of ideas and meaning through those measurements. They were trying to relate the proportions of mankind with a higher power, whether that was divinity or geometry, or divine geometry. For these artists, canons weren't merely a cliff's notes for the human body, right? They were a tool for understanding and communicating man's place in the universe. Now, when I skipped from Vitruvius to Leonardo, I jumped ahead about 1,500 years. And it's true that Vitruvius's book, De Architectura, was lost and unknown to the world until about 1415, and Leonardo made his famous drawing in 1490. But before Leonardo got his hands on Vitruvius, another Renaissance man had a crack at him, and this guy approached the issues of canons from a new and interesting way. Now, this man was Leon Battista Alberti, the subject of my last podcast. In that podcast, I discussed his treatise on sculpture called De Statua, but I only briefly mentioned Alberti's treatment of canons of proportion, so I'm going to cover that now. Alberti was certainly very familiar with Vitruvius and probably understood him more than just about anyone at the time. Before writing De Statua, Alberti wrote a treatise on architecture called De Re Edificatoria, or in English, On the Art of Building. And like Vitruvius's work, it's divided into 10 books. To say that Alberti was heavily influenced by Vitruvius is an understatement. To be sure, Alberti made notable contributions to architecture with this work, and it remained the primary reference book for builders and architects for 3 centuries after it was written. But some sections of it are really just reworkings of Vitruvius, and it was the means by which many Renaissance artists and architects first came into contact with the ideas of Vitruvius. So one might expect that in De Statua, Leon Battista Alberti might have simply repeated Vitruvius's canon, or maybe offered his own version of it. In fact, Alberti records a fundamentally different approach for formulating a canon of proportions, different from all others we have discussed so far. And I'll let Alberti speak for himself. So, quote, "I have taken the trouble to describe the main measurements that are in man, and not merely the details of this or of that man, but as far as I could, I wanted to fix that precise beauty, granted as a gift from nature, the nearly universal specified proportions given to many bodies, and even put it in writing, in imitation of the man from Croton, who in making a statue of a goddess went around choosing several virgins, beautiful above all other women, the finest and rarest and most endowed particulars of beauty that is seen in youth, and then put them into his statue. In the same way, I have chosen many bodies, each healthy and beautiful, and I extracted all of their measurements and proportions. Then I made comparisons, laying aside the excesses of the extreme, if any were exaggerated or larger than others, and retrieved the median from several bodies and models, which I am calling the most laudatory." Unquote. So here we see an entirely new way of developing a canon, right? Alberti is not looking at all at the way one part relates to another part of the body. Instead of a base unit such as a palm or a little finger by which the rest of the body is measured, Alberti simply measures each part and records them using common measurement. The second big difference is Alberti is not trying to imply perfection or a physical ideal with his canon. Instead, he is seeking a normative measurement of beauty. And to do so, he measured several individuals, threw out any outliers that might blow the curve of the average, and found a median measurement. Now, we might call this type of canon an anthropometric canon. That is, it's a canon based on normative measurement of each part. And this is the kind of canon that shoots for accuracy and likeness, the type of canon that might be a little bit more at home with the practices of contemporary figurative sculptors, who use a canon to construct a figure in lieu of using a model, rather than creating an idealized type. So we have two types of canon, right? We have relational and anthropometric, which serve two different goals: representation of an ideal and representation of the real. Alberti has devised his canon in order to be used to create a plausible figure, to be used as a guide and as a technique in the creation of sculpture. He's not trying to relate humanity or perfection or an ideal or harmony. He's just trying to get the figure to look right. One aspect that should not be overlooked in Alberti's canon is that although he strives for an average to produce his canon, it's an average of pre-selected subjects, right? It's not a true cross-section of the population, right? He went around and picked out people he thought were beautiful, right? That's what he started with. So on the one hand, it's hardly a scientific objective study of human proportion. But on the other hand, it's a canon produced by a single artist according to that artist's individual taste. We can presume that Alberti's canon, as he records it, is reflecting Alberti's own conception of beauty. In fact, I think it would be a very interesting exercise to repeat Alberti's experiment. Go and select a dozen or so of what I personally consider to be the most beautiful specimens of humanity, take their measurements and come up with an average. Would the end product be a reflection of my innate taste? Would it be more than the sum of its parts or less? What would it tell me about the physical types which hold my interest? In any event, these two types of canon, relational and anthropometric, each had their adherents and formulators from the early Renaissance all the way up till today. Relational canons have been the more popular choice for artists overall, it would seem. The ideals which relational canons are meant to convey were popular with classicists, in the Renaissance, as well as the adherents of the Baroque, right through, of course, the neoclassicist era, which lasted well into the 19th century. So those who developed relational canons included, so many people. Albrecht Dürer, Jacob de Witt, Jean Cousin, and Charles Blanc. Now, as director of the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris in the 1860s, Charles Blanc, he formulated a canon for the use of the students of the school, the students of the école, which became known as the Canon des Ateliers, or the studio canon. All the canons I've just mentioned, that of Dürer, de Witt, Cousin, and Blanc, they're all relational canons. But taken as a whole, we see that the general trend over these few centuries was to improve upon the work of previous relational canons in terms of fidelity to nature. That is, instead of trying to fit the human body into mathematical proportion to create an ideal, these artists more and more attempted to formulate a canon that, while still being a relational canon, produced a more normative result. So while the canon of Jean Cousin describes the body as 8 heads high, which is consistent with a heroic statue of ancient Greek sculptural proportions, Charles Blanc, he finds that a more normative height is 7.5 heads. Now, 7.5 heads is indeed closer to the average in living subjects, but its accuracy comes at the sacrifice of a nice round number, like 8, right? As well as any notion of numerical balance and proportion which might express an ideal. 7.5 really isn't exactly a mystical number. So here we have the idea of canons of proportion moving towards a more modern view of them, right? As more or less a convenient shorthand, a substitute for visual analysis of a living subject. Now, as we move into the 19th century and the sciences of surgery and anatomy and anthropology really start to come into their own, we see the canons further defined in terms of accuracy to a norm. One recurring issue with canons of proportion up to this point has been how vague some of the points from which to measure have been. For instance, a particular canon might dictate that the height of the knee is 2 heads high, right? But it doesn't define where on the knee you're measuring to, right? Are you measuring to the patella? If so, where on the patella? The center or the top or the bottom? And is the knee in general relaxed or tensed, right? A weight-bearing leg is going to be a tensed leg, and the patella moves vertically depending on tension of the leg. So this and several other vagaries of measurement were actually addressed by the 19th century French sculptor Paul Richer, who was remarkably also a surgeon. His exhaustive work on the study of the human figure for artists is called Anatomie Artistique, known to many listeners, I am sure, as Artistic Anatomy, through the translation into English by Robert Beverly Hale. Now, in this fantastic book, Richer has a chapter on canons of proportions. He gives a brief history of these canons and then introduces his own canon, which is largely a clarification of Charles Blanc's Canon des Ateliers, combined with some points taken from an anthropological study done by a Dr. Taupenard. The greatest improvement Richer makes is in providing exact anatomical points from which to measure. Most of these points are located on the skeletal system so that they are as constant and as immobile as possible. Using the skeleton for measurement also helps reduce the phenomenon of the more superficial measurements changing depending on the pose of the model, right? Limbs in general tend to shorten when they're flexed, right? The lengths of limbs from the outside. Of course, the bones don't shorten. Now, most interestingly, these refinements towards a more accurate canon lead directly back to the technique that Leon Battista Alberti recommended 500 years previously, right? The technique of computing an average taken from many subjects. However, even Dr. Richer did not go so far as to eliminate much of the more commonly used practices, the idea of a figure being 7.5 heads high, and so on. But as Richer himself says, quote, "In offering ideas on the proportions of the human body, I have had no other aim than to put at the disposition of the artist certain useful and precise measurements. They represent no more than a sort of average, which should be changed at will according to the artist's aesthetic conception, his fantasy, or his genius." So over the centuries, we see the nature and the purpose of canons shift, right? From representing the ideal to representing the average. From imbuing the figure with symbolic significance through proportion and number, to imbuing the figure with mere biological plausibility. With the evolution of a merely accurate canon, at the sacrifice of notions of the ideal, we may have lost as much as gained, though the losses probably say more about the sea changes occurring within the culture at large rather than the nature of the arts. That said, there have been a few notable examples of 19th and 20th century sculptors in search of a canon of proportions which can speak to a higher purpose than mere biological plausibility. One man who pursued the golden ratio in a canon of proportions was a German psychologist and mathematician named Adolf Zeising. Now, writing in the 1850s, Zeising proposed that the growth of the skeleton in animals was governed by the golden ratio. He had already seen the way branches and leaves on certain plants arrange themselves according to the golden ratio, and that they can be predicted using the golden ratio. And he conducted a lot of research into human proportion along the same lines. Zeising's attempt to align the golden ratio with human proportion was highly influential in the 19th century. Now, the golden ratio, or phi as it is sometimes known, it's at the top of the list of the usual suspects, which are thought maybe to contain the key of beauty through proportion. Phi, or the golden ratio, or the golden section, or the golden mean, there are lots of different names for the same thing. The golden ratio is a very particular ratio which can exist between two measurements. Very briefly, if you take a line of any length, there is exactly one place on that line, one point on that line, where you to break that line at that point the ratio of length between the large line and the small line is the same ratio between the large part and the original line. To put it another way, if you have a line that equals 1 meter and another line that is 1 meter and 61.8 centimeters or so, the relation of those two lines to each other, it approximates the golden ratio. Yeah, I know, I didn't explain that well, and it would probably take me a half hour to do so. But so many others have written about the golden ratio that you should probably for now just Google it if you need to. But anyway, it's enough to understand here that there are a lot of places in nature where this ratio of parts occurs, especially in organic, growing, and living things, from the distribution of sunflower seeds in the head of a sunflower to the curve of a certain type of seashell. All right, you find it everywhere in nature. And the idea has arisen over the centuries that this ratio, it hides a key to natural or perhaps even divine creation and growth. And furthermore, is the key to what humans find visually pleasing. All right, so it should be no wonder that someone should try to create a canon of proportions which incorporates the golden ratio. One sculptor interested in the potential to once again link significant mathematics and meaningful number to the proportions of the human body was the sculptor William Wetmore Story. He was an American sculptor. He lived and worked in Rome in the later half of the 19th century, and he had achieved pretty good success there and also back in the United States. But in 1864, he published a little-known but fascinating book, and it's entitled The Proportions of the Human Figure According to a New Canon for Practical Use, with a critical notice of the canon of Polyclitus and the principal ancient and modern systems. Now, that book is available for free. It's in the public domain. You can download it. If you want to give it a read, it's out there. Now, the aim of Story's book, aside from a critique of several canons of proportion throughout history, was to unify the aims of different canons in general into one single canon. He was trying to come up with a really, truly universal canon. Now, we've talked about the two general purposes of canon. One purpose is to express metaphysical ideal, and the other is to accurately describe the human form with a normative system. Well, William Wetmore Story, like several before him, he was after the holy grail of figurative work. He wanted the unification of the divine mathematics of the Greeks, the perfect geometry of Leonardo da Vinci, the observation and rationalism of Leon Battista Alberti, as well as the golden ratio. And he even wanted to include the sort of Greco-Judeo-Christian theology of number and form, which is known as Gematria. He wanted to take all these different systems and different ways of looking at the human body and figuring it out and combine it into a single canon. Now, I mentioned Gematria. What is Gematria? Well, Gematria is an ancient method of interpretation of divine will, similar to astrology or palm reading, right? Instead of interpreting God's will through the position of the stars or lines on your hand, Gematria is used to interpret holy texts and scriptures to unlock their true secret meaning through simple mathematics. It's an esoteric sort of pursuit. I imagine it's probably just as reliable as reading God's will in the stars, or your hand, or anywhere else. But you find Gematria in the Hebrew Kabbalah, and it pops up in Christian theology as well. But actually, its foundational concepts go back as far as the cult of Pythagoras. And basically, Gematria is the attachment of attributes to number, right? So like in astrology, where different stars correspond to certain personality traits, in Gematria, different numbers represent different aspects of the cosmos, right? So each number from 0 to 9 has certain attributes, like the signs of the zodiac do. But in addition, Gematria assigns numerical value to letters of the alphabet. So, for instance, in English, A equals 1, B equals 2, and so on. So words are given a numerical value by adding up their letter values, just like you're playing Scrabble, right? 1 is unity. That's the attribute of 1 is unity or God. 2 is duality. No surprise there. It's also the attribute of woman. 3 is harmony. and it also represents man. 4 is the earth, 5 is creation, and so on and so forth. And when you add numbers together, this is the kind of cool thing. You add numbers together, you're also compiling significance. So for instance, 6 is the number for marriage, because 1 plus 2 plus 3 equals 6. But 1 plus 2 plus 3 is also God plus man plus woman, right? So that's the number of marriage. The number for the cosmos, for the universe, is 10, because God plus man plus woman plus earth, 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4, equals 10. So William Wetmore's story, let's go back to him. He begins his book with a discussion and an explanation of Gematria, touching upon Pythagoras, Plato, Polyclitus, the Jewish Kabbalah, the Christian book of Revelation, and much, much more. He notes their similarities of pursuit and concludes that there must be a fundamental truth behind them all. And he explains his goals for his canons like this, quote, "In the Kabbalah is to be found the key to the secret meaning of certain words, signs, and numbers. As to the mystic interpretation of words, we have nothing here to do, but signs, numbers, and symbols lie at the root of the whole matter of proportion and symmetry. And by a study of these, we may perhaps arrive at some canon of proportion more simple, scientific, and exact than any which we have at present, and perhaps discover the long-lost canons of Egypt and Greece. What at present is to be sought for is a canon which will answer mystically to number and symbol, and be an absolute geometric statement of proportion. Pythagoras and Plato declared that the beautiful had this exact mathematical and geometrical foundation." So, to me it sounds like he's really searching for the canons of the ancients, like many others had before him. But, okay, putting all the mysticism aside for a moment, let's actually look at the nuts and bolts of Story's canon. Because it's kind of, it's different. And his system isn't a simple one. And maybe it's even too complex really to lay on the table right here. But as I said, the book is out there. It's available freely. So if you know where to, download books on the internet, you can find this one. I also have a few images which illustrate his ideas on the website, thesculptorsfuneral.com, so you can check that out there. But in a nutshell, William Story, he bases a system upon simple geometric forms, much like Vitruvius and Leonardo da Vinci did, when he placed the human figure inside of a perfect circle and then placing that inside of a perfect square. These perfect forms of a four-sided square and a perfect circle have numerical significance for Story, but Story's arrangement of geometry starts with both a square and an equilateral triangle circumscribed by a circle. So it's kind of like the image of Vitruvian man, but with a triangle as well. Again, check out the website for an illustration. Or, hey, if you got a piece of paper and a pencil handy, do this. Just go ahead and draw a circle, okay? Now put a square in that circle so that, the 4 points of the square touching the rim of the circle, and then do the same thing with an equilateral triangle. So notice that the triangle crosses the sides of the square at certain points, sort of dividing the sides of the square, and of course the square divides the triangle in the same way. Now, William Wetmore's Story asserts that the divisions of these geometric shapes and the ratios of one segment to another correspond with ratios of lengths to be found in the human body. Basically, if you take the side of the square as the height of your figure, then the way the triangle divides it at a certain point is going to represent the length of an arm. Again, I explain this a little bit better on my website. Go look at the image gallery at thesculptorsfuneral.com. You'll be able to sort of figure it out. So Story then provides in his book a list of which segments of these geometric forms represent the lengths and ratios of various parts of the body. And then at the end of the book, William Story provides an interesting set of tables which compare his canon to many other historical canons of proportion. It's probably the most valuable and interesting part of the book. So is this sort of canon a spiritual exercise for magical thinkers? Or is it really a useful tool for sculptors? Well, you be the judge. Now, while I'm sure that there are some true believers who take this sort of stuff very seriously, there is an actual use for this sort of divination, even for the non-believer. And I'll take again the example of horoscopes to explain this. Now, we've all scanned the horoscope pages in the newspaper to read what our stars have in store for us on a given day, right? Even if we have no faith at all in that sort of thing, we've all read horoscopes. And the readings your horoscope may give you are vague, right? They're usually vague enough to be equally applicable to most people. But the real value of the horoscope isn't as a provider of God's will or of your destiny or any such thing. It's a simple tool for means of self-examination. Now, when you read your horoscope, you test it, right? You look for the parts which seem relevant to your life. Now, these, of course, are just coincidences, but for a few moments, what you're doing, you're just taking time out of your day to examine your life, whether you realize you're doing it or not. You examine your life and how you've chosen to live it relative to a certain proposition proffered by the horoscope. So, for instance, when your horoscope says something like, "Be on the lookout for love," you, whether you take horoscopes seriously or not, just for a moment, you sort of examine that, you hold it up in comparison to your own life, and you make a judgment based on it, right? Just for a moment, you examine your life in terms of the love that is in it, or the love you want, or the love you need. Let's say you're happily married, and you hear, "Be on the lookout for love." It simply might mean to you that you should be mindful and appreciative of the love you share with another. Or maybe you are unhappily married. Then the phrase might lead you to wonder why you're with the person you're with, and wonder if maybe there's someone out there you should be with instead. And to a single person, that same phrase, "Be on the lookout for love," just might be an encouragement to be open to possibilities throughout your day. So a horoscope doesn't actually contain personal significant insight. It's the other way around. Each reader brings personal significance to the horoscope. And in this way, with the right mindset, a well-written horoscope is more of a call to meditation on one's life, but only if you appreciate it for what it is and understand what it is not. Anyway, all this is to say that I get the feeling William Wetmore Story's canon, apart from whether it is actually useful in the construction of a sculpted figure, has much the same purpose for William Wetmore Story himself. It's a tool for self-examination. And I don't know if Story ever put his canon to use in his own work. I mean, his own work exhibits a typical sort of late neoclassicism. And, well, who knows? It may be that his canon actually gave him something close to the measurements of the Greeks. And this classicism arises from his own canon. But as for the theological or spiritual significance of ratio and number, and its relation to geometry, and its manifestation in ideal human form, I feel that working from a canon which claims to provide such significance is solely for the spiritual benefit of the creator of the work, and these significances will go unnoticed by the uninformed viewer. Okay, so back to Dr. Zeising. Remember the guy who studied the golden ratio? Well, Zeising's research into a canon of proportion containing the golden ratio didn't just influence mystical thinkers like William Wetmore Story. His work also had a big impact on the Swiss-French architect Charles-Édouard Généré-Gris, also known as Le Corbusier. Now, Le Corbusier was one of the founding figures of modern architecture in the early 20th century. He basically invented and popularized the high-rise apartment block, as he was very interested in providing better living conditions for inhabitants of large cities, and he sought ways to create new, modern environments and structures. Now, a lot of people don't like Le Corbusier's architecture, including me, but that's sort of beside the point in our discussion. The reason I bring up Le Corbusier is that he invented a sort of canon of proportions, based in part on Dr. Zeising's work using the golden ratio, to develop a canon not to be used to create sculpture, but rather to create architecture based on the proportions of the human body. So Le Corbusier did something along the lines of what Vitruvius was doing, and Leon Battista Alberti as well. He applied measurements of the human form to create architectural proportions. But Le Corbusier went further. He wanted to give his canon of proportions a sort of universality, but a universality very, very different from William Wetmore Story's spiritual universality. Le Corbusier designed his canon of human proportions to incorporate not only the golden rule, but also to incorporate the metric system and the United States standard of measurement. So contained in one system, you have feet, inches, and meters, and the golden ratio, and they all work together to describe the human form in its parts and as a whole, and whose measurements and parts can be used as a basis for a new architecture. Le Corbusier called this system the modulor. He wanted the modulor to be the basis of a new international architecture, applicable and standardized for use all over the world, no matter if the measurements were in feet or meters, and it would incorporate the intrinsic and universal beauty of proportion in both the human body and in the golden ratio. So it was pretty ambitious. But it was actually only used to construct architecture only a handful of times. But it is a fascinating bookend, I think, to the story of human proportions and its role in architecture, which begins with Vitruvius. But at the end of the day, do figurative sculptors today even rely on canons? I am not actually sure if I know any sculptors who use canons of proportion on a regular basis. And it may be because my own background and education stressed visual information from a live model so much, it seems that using a canon of proportion and a live model for the same work, it would provide contradictory information. And this is where the limitations of my own personal experience start to show. So if you use a canon of proportions on a regular basis in your own work, I would love to hear from you. I'd love to know which canon you use. Did you invent your own? Are you using, Vitruvius? So leave a post on our Facebook page or on the website, thesculptorsfuneral.com, or you can even email me at thesculptorsfuneral@gmail.com. Oh, you know what? Actually, I do know of a type of sculptor who this type of sculptor relies heavily on canons of proportions, and I wonder if we actually have any listening to the podcast. I'm talking about animators, 3D animation, whether it's claymation like Wallace and Gromit, or computer animation like Toy Story, right? Doing that sort of animation involves creating several or dozens or sometimes even hundreds of individual models of the same character. Of course, each iteration of a character has to look exactly like the others, and this is where a canon of proportion would come in handy. Now, certainly, two-dimensional illustrators use canons for the same reason. You can't have Homer Simpson gaining and losing weight from shot to shot, or angle to angle. Nor can we have Superman, growing shorter or taller from panel to panel throughout a comic book, right? There has to exist a formula for the construction of Superman or the construction of Homer Simpson, just as there would be for every other character in an animated series or a Disney or a Pixar animation. It seems, though, that this type of canon falls into a third category, right? It's different from the other two we've discussed. Rather than searching for an ideal or producing a norm, the true purpose of this type of canon is consistency across multiple iterations of a figure. So I think I've covered most of the basic ground here on canons of proportion. There, of course, is just so much more to it, as there is with everything I talk about on The Sculptor's Funeral, and I encourage you to do your own study of the topic and draw your own conclusions. And if you do, of course, the rest of us want to hear your ideas. And you know where to go, sculptorsfuneral.com or on the Facebook page, The Sculptor's Funeral. It's a small but growing community, and your contribution is welcome. So you might have noticed a little mention of audible.com at the beginning of this podcast. Yes, it's true. I now have a sponsor. I have to do it, folks. I want to keep the podcast free to listen to, but I also don't want to go into debt keeping it online, and it costs money to keep back episodes on the server. And the more episodes I make, the more it's going to cost. So from here on out, you'll hear an ad or two during the podcast. I hope it doesn't spoil your listening experience. I really do. But keep in mind, it helps pay the bills here, and it also means I don't have to beg you for donations all the time, which I think would be even more annoying. But the cool thing is that I have absolute control over who I choose to sponsor The Sculptor's Funeral, and so you're not going to hear any ads that aren't in some way relevant to sculpture or the topics which The Sculptor's Funeral covers. If I'm going to hawk a product, it's going to be something that you actually might want. So that's why audible.com I think is a pretty good fit. Audible, if you don't know, is the #1 source for audiobooks, like books on tape that your mom used to get from the library. Well, they're now online. And so if you have the time and inclination to listen to the podcast, you probably have the time and inclination to listen to an audiobook, especially one that relates to the discussion we have going on here. For instance, so far the Donatello podcast has been the most popular episode I've done. Well, if you want to learn more about Donatello's time and the early Renaissance in general, you can download for free an audiobook of Giorgio Vasari's Lives of the Artists. That's, I think, pretty awesome. Or you could download the book Heretics and Heroes, How Renaissance Artists and Reformation Priests Created Our World. And it's read by the author, Thomas Cahill. I just went to Audible and I searched their collection using the search term Renaissance. I came up with 97 results. So there's tons there to learn from. And here's the best part. For you, the listeners of The Sculptor's Funeral, Audible is offering a free audiobook download with a 30-day trial to give you an opportunity to check out their service. Basically, you sign up for their subscription and you get to download any book you want for free. The subscription after the first month is $14.95, which gets you a book a month of your choice. But keep in mind, the audiobooks are like tens of hours long. I mean, I just downloaded one that's like 18 hours of audio. So a book a month is actually plenty, at least it is for me. And if you start listening to the book you picked and you don't like it, you can actually exchange it for a different one. And if you decide you don't want to continue subscribing, even right after you get your first free book, you can just cancel the subscription. It's easy enough. So to download your free audiobook today, go to audibletrial.com/sculpt. Again, that's audibletrial.com/sculpt, SCULPT, and that's how you're going to get your free audiobook. Now, why is the /sculpt part important? Well, when you log on to audible.com with that URL, with audibletrial.com/sculpt, it tells Audible that I sent you, right? And every time someone signs up for the free trial at audibletrial.com/sculpt, that listener is making a direct contribution to the Sculptor's Funeral. I mean, like a contribution, like money in the bank, even though it costs you nothing, all right? So you can help keep the podcast going by making someone else give me money. So do it. I know most of us sculptors are, illiterate anyway, so podcasts and audiobooks are right up our alley. So give it a try. I did. I actually just signed up for the first time, and I got a copy of a book called The Feud That Sparked the Renaissance, How Brunelleschi and Ghiberti Changed the Art World by Paul Robert Walker. And I can't wait to hear it. Well, that's it for The Sculptor's Funeral this week. Thanks again for listening, and I'll be back soon.